Welcome to our exclusive YouTube channel, the Ministry of the Real Truth. This is, let us say, a part 2 in regards to the stele of the Nestorian Church, or the monument of the Nestorian Church, found in China many years ago. This book is based on the reception in the West of this monument by Michael Kivac in 1962. The Story of a Stele, China's Nestorian Monument and its reception in the West, 1625 to 1916 by Michael Kivac. Contents page. List of illustrations, acknowledgements, prologue, epilogue, notes, works cited and index. Illustrations throughout this book. Acknowledgements. Research for this book was facilitated by generous support from the National Science Council in Taiwan. Their generosity has been unstinting, and he thanks the staff at the Taiwan National Library and so forth. Prologue. The story of a stone. The author's freshman composition teacher taught him never to begin an essay by saying what it is not. Begin, he would say firmly and repeatedly, by saying what your argument is, not what it isn't. While obviously he's never forgotten this directive, and like all teachers, he found himself repeating it to his own students, yet he still felt compelled to begin this book with a few knots, owing to the peculiar nature of the subject at hand. The Story of a Stele is a book about Western perceptions of a Chinese object, but it is not a book of sinology. His competence in the Chinese language and in Chinese history is exceedingly limited, or was exceedingly limited. This book uses no Chinese apart from a few keywords, and makes no attempt to analyse the 2,000 character Chinese inscription that is carved onto the front of the stone. It also does not make more than a limited attempt to review the scholarship in Chinese that has been published since the stone's discovery in 1625, and especially the new and flourishing work that has grown out of recent events in China itself from then onwards, when such Western subjects as the stone were no longer actively discouraged or considered taboo. In short, this is necessarily a Western book by a Western author, and the author also makes no claims that simply because he has lived there and taught in a Chinese and Taiwanese speaking place for the past 15 years, he has no more authority to discuss the subject than anyone else. In fact, it is, or was, precisely the opposite. If he should work in an East Asian context but still be interested in writing a book about the stone, it only serves to prove the point. Why is he, too, so intrigued by this particular object? What has drawn him to it? This is the story of a stone that took Europeans by storm in the 17th century, at first mainly among the missionary community, but soon spreading to a far larger scholarly audience. It is the story of the life of an object, and as a life story it has meaning and continues to have meaning in the eyes of particular beholders, and according to certain interpretations that can never be free from prejudice, or they one can try to be aware of it as much as possible. Its title is also meant to echo a much more famous and important book, The Story of the Stone, a standard English translation of an alternate title of one of the most famous novels in all of Chinese literature, The Dream of the Red Chamber, composed by Cao Zhuquan in the mid-18th century. It is also a book in which a story is prompted by the discovery of a stone with an inscription. In Chinese, however, the difference between definite and indefinite articles is frequently unimportant or unspecified. But since he is writing in English, the author, and speaking from a Western point of view, he insists on the distinction between the story of that stone and the story of this one. The story of the stone that is so celebrated in Chinese literature, and the story of a stone that has caused such turbulence in the West for nearly 400 years. And so forth. A stone discovered one day in 1625 in the ancient Chinese capital of Xi'an in the province of Shaanxi in northwestern China. A group of workers accidentally unearthed a large limestone stele, an enormous black tablet about 3 meters high, 1 meter wide, and half a meter deep. The front and sides were exquisitely carved with a long inscription that included both Chinese and a Syriac script known as Estrangelo. The text, dated 781, eulogized the history and spread of a religion it referred to as Qingjiao, the luminous or illustrious or brilliant teaching, which had come to China from a faraway land called Daqin. Above the inscription was the title in 9 large characters, a monument commemorating the propagation of the Daqin luminous religion in the Middle Kingdom, i.e. China. The top of the pillar was sculpted in the form of intricately entwined dragon-like figures, between which was a large circular object, usually identified as a pearl. As was customary, the discovery was brought at once to the attention of local officials, who set it up on top of a tortoise-shaped pedestal to keep it from sinking, and had it placed on the grounds of a nearby Buddhist temple. Figure 1, see page 6. The tablet was obviously considered worthy of note and given a place of some distinction, and no other culture more reveres or more meticulously documents its history than does Chinese culture. But by the same token, stone monuments of every imaginable size and age were ubiquitous throughout the empire, and not only at temple sites. Symbols such as the dragons and the pearl, sometimes marks of royal family, and found on numerous other sculptures of the time, were also familiar. The pedestal, although not original, was even more common, and alluded to the tradition that the world is carried on the back of a tortoise. A literate viewer might also have appreciated the brilliantly elusive and rhetorical nature of the inscription. Its calligraphic style, in an almost perfect state of preservation, was lauded from the very beginning. There it is there. Around 1892, photograph of the monument from Henry Havret, the Christian Stele or Stele of Xi'an, front piece to volume 1, just visible at the bottom of the monument base in the shape is the shape of a head of a tortoise. National Taiwan University Library there. Looks like it's quite tall. But the Syriac writing was completely indecipherable, and the precise nature of the Qingjiao religion, if anyone had bothered to think about it at all, would have remained similarly strange and mysterious. What would the Chinese viewer have thought of all of this? A fringe faith that for a brief period of time had been magnanimously tolerated by a few emperors in the distant past of the Tang or Tang dynasty, an age where foreign religious sects were greeted with a certain degree of acceptance. What bearing could the Qingjiao religion have had on the lives of late Ming-era Buddhists, Taoists, or Neo-Confucians? What did the monument have to do with China, the perceived centre of the world and the quintessence of human civilization? It might come as something of a shock to learn then that the discovery of this particular object changed forever the course of Western perceptions about China and became a cornerstone of modern sinological study as a whole. For while the stone was quickly forgotten, it remained almost completely undisturbed in the Middle Kingdom. News of its discovery spread like wildfire in Europe, first among Jesuit missionaries and then throughout the larger scholarly community, where the tablet was accorded a level of attention that was nothing less than obsessive. Learned debate over its every aspect, from the precise meaning of the inscription to the true date and locations of its unearthing, filled innumerable volumes for centuries to come. Already by the 1660s, one translator noted that he had 8 previous renditions in his possession, and by 1920 there were over 40 versions available in Western languages. The monument, in short, fell upon the European community like a bombshell, and all because of one last detail that the author has hitherto left unmentioned, and which to Western eyes had the surprising effect of making the object seem entirely comprehensible, even if almost no one in Europe was able to read what was written upon it. For also on the face of the tablet, prominently centered above the title, and placed underneath the dragons within a pyramid shape, there was carved a large cross. As you can see here, a couple of dragons here on the side. Somewhat difficult to see at first, it was incised with slightly flared arms and circular forms at its centre, and its extremities sitting atop what appears to be a cloud and flowers. Figure 2, see page 8. One can easily imagine how the existence of a cross on an ancient Chinese monument might have captured the imagination of a European audience, even if this particular example is really a combination of Eastern and Western motifs. Clouds can be Taoist or Mohammedan. The flowers might be lotus or lily, Buddhist or Christian. Yet such minutiae mattered little to earlier modern Europeans. To them a cross was a cross, which is to say a contemporary Christian symbol. In fact, as the author tried to show, the existence of something so apparently Western came to represent China in pre-modern Europe, and like the monument as a whole, European reading of the cross had little to do with China as it really was. Like China itself, the stone was more of a screen onto which Western presuppositions and preoccupations could be conveniently projected. For finding a cross on an antique Chinese tablet, as we will see, was both an astonishing discovery and something that Europeans had actually been expecting all along. And this is a rubbing of the top of the monument, showing a symbolically ornamented cross surrounded by cloud and flower motifs. National Taiwan University Library. But in exactly what way is this a Christian monument at all? By what term should we refer to it? The text of the Jingqiao Bei, as it is called in Chinese, Bei being the word for stone tablet, consists of 3 main parts, totaling approximately 1,800 Chinese characters, written from top to bottom and right to left in columns, as well as the Syriac portions, mostly confined to the borders and sides. The opening section, columns 1 to 8, is a doctrinal introduction. It begins by praising a great, invisible and ineffable 3-in-1 God called Elohim, in modern Mandarin pronunciation, a name usually equated with the Hebrew Elohim. This is actually probably talking about Allah, but it does relate to the Hebrew Elohim, they state, which is the God or the gods, who created the heavens and the earth and then man, but it'd be more like Allah in the Aramaic. But man was deceived by Satan, i.e. Satan, who brought all kinds of evil into the world, until at last the 3-in-1 God, let's see this triunity there, proof of the triune, appeared among human beings as Meshiach, the Chinese rendering of the Syriac word for Messiah. A virgin gave birth to a holy one in Dakin, whatever you say it in Chinese, Dakin, and Persians came forth to pay tribute. A new teaching was established of good deeds and true faith, and Satan was defeated, or Satan. Meshiach, or the Messiah, returned to heaven, leaving 27 scriptures behind him, thus allowing human beings to be cleansed and purified to their former state. His ministers bear the sign of the cross and travel throughout the world asserting love and charity. They let their beards grow but shave their foreheads. They fast, keep no slaves, and accumulate no wealth. They make no distinction between rich and poor, and worship to the east 7 times a day. A bit like the Mohammedans or the Muslims, they point themselves to the east 7 times a day, praying for the living and the dead. On the 7th day they had a special service to cleanse themselves. All of these teachings are difficult to name. This section concludes, but taken together they can be identified as the luminous religion. The next section is historical. It begins by alluding to the necessity of a wise sovereign for the Qingjiao religion to spread. Only in this way will the world become enlightened, and such sovereigns duly appear, we are told, in the form of the Tang emperors. The religion first arrived in China through the efforts of a monk named Alu Bin, who came from the kingdom of Dakun in 635. His teaching was examined and approved by the reigning emperor, who issued an imperial edict allowing for its dissemination. A monastery was built in Chang'an, now Xi'an, and the religion soon spread throughout the empire. At the beginning of the 8th century, a period of struggle ensued with both Buddhists and Taoists, but by 742, the reigning emperor had accepted the Qingjiao religion once more, and in 744 the emperor himself composed tablets to be hung on the gates of the chief monastery. Later emperors also helped to rebuild the monasteries, giving them gifts and other forms of support. Finally, the religion's great benefactor, and apparently the donor of the monument, Yi Si, who was one of the emperor's most highly decorated officials and a top-level military officer, donated his fortune to the monasteries and to the assistance of the poor. The inscription then concludes with a celebratory poem, columns 24 to 29, which praises once again the beauty and the eternal truth of the luminous religion, or the religion of light, as well as the glory and prosperity of the Tang emperors. At the end, the date is given in both the Chinese and Syriac calendars, along with the name of the calligrapher and a few other officials in both languages. The sides of the tablet features list of names from throughout the Qingjiao religion's 150-year history in the Chinese Empire. Today, the tablet is usually referred to in the West as the Nestorian Monument, since the luminous religion is now recognized as a branch of the Christian sect known as Nestorianism, an early offshoot of the Eastern Church, whose patriarch, a 5th century bishop from Antioch called Nestorius, had been involved in a bitter dispute over whether the Virgin Mary could properly be referred to as the Mother of God. Nestorianism became a somewhat loose and baggy term that could encompass many different doctrinal questions and historical circumstances, but over the next several hundred years, the Church of the East, as it called itself, had spread throughout Western and Central Asia into the Chinese Empire via Mesopotamia and Persia and along established trade routes. Its followers were zealous missionaries. They travelled throughout the world. The inscription says it used Syriac in its liturgy. The number of Nestorians during the Tang period was probably rather small, however, as it remained a foreign community composed mainly of traders and mercenaries. Later visitors to China, for example, Marco Polo, in the late 13th century regularly spoke about the existence of Nestorian Christians. Yet these medieval Nestorians were almost certainly not descendants of the ones described on the face of the monument, since in China the sect had died out by the end of the 9th century, following a decree issued in 845 in which all foreign religious sects, Buddhism in particular, were attacked. Buddhists were considered foreigners too. In fact, as far as we can tell, the monument was only in place for about 60 years before it was buried, perhaps in order to protect it from the effects of this decree, in which all priests and monks, including specifically more than 3,000 belonging to the Darkin and Mohammedan or Zoroastrian religions, were ordered to return to secular life. Hey, that's interesting. They're referring here as the Mohammedan religion as Zoroastrian religion, were ordered to return to secular life. In other words, when the stone was discovered in 1625, it had been underground for 800 years. To a Western reader, the Qingjiao religion certainly seems Christian in character, proclaiming as it does a biblical creation myth, a three-in-one God, or a triune, a Messiah, and a virgin birth. But the problem has always been how these features should be judged in terms of the Chinese or Syriac nomenclature, in which they are expressed, or in terms of the broader Buddhist, Taoist, Confucian and Nestorian traditions from which the monument derives. Despite the existence of a cross, very few 17th century Chinese would even have made a connection between the Qingjiao religion and Christianity, which at the time was merely another form of moral teaching from far away that had been promulgated by a small group of learned men for the past 40 years. Most of them Jesuit missionaries. A few local scholars did manage to think of Western Christianity, but it is hardly surprising that most of them were Christian converts. The earliest witness we know of, a local scholar named Shaanxi, came at once to see the stone and sent a rubbing of a centuries-old process by which stone inscriptions are reproduced on an inked sheet of paper to his friend Li Xiao, one of the highest-ranking Christian converts in early modern China. Li published the text of the tablet in the same year, along with a short commentary called After Reading the Inscription on the Luminous Religion Monument. Importantly, however, even Li could not be entirely sure what he was looking at. This religion has never been heard of before, he began. Might it be the same holy religion of the West that has been preached by Matteo Ricci, one of the pioneer Jesuit missionaries in China? I have read it through and thought that it is. He then goes on to list all those things in the inscription that match Christianity, thereby allowing him to comment further upon what he reasoned as the monument's real importance. In other words, it was not necessarily a simple task to equate an 8th century Sino-Syriac inscription with the doctrines of an early modern European Catholic Christianity, and the text required a great deal of interpretation before it could be understood as such. The Jesuits certainly felt this difficulty too. Their 1625 annual report on the China mission cautiously noted that while the discovery of the tablet was undoubtedly a noteworthy event, the text, or the poem as they called it, contained many equivocal and confused expressions, with a number of pagan terms that were very different and obscure, to say nothing of the metaphors and literary allusions. So were they trying to stomp on it, make it look bad, because they were propagating their Jesuit religion? Maybe, maybe not. They say it contained many equivocal and confused expressions with a number of pagan terms that were very difficult and obscure, to say nothing of the metaphors and literary allusions. The report translated Qingjiao as doctrine clear in the French version, and it wondered whether that again might be the same as Judah. It gave a translation of the part of the inscription in which the emperor approved of Eluobin's activities, clearly important for Jesuit purposes, as we will explain later. But the report withheld further judgment until a full and accurate copy of the entire text could be obtained. Father Tregault, a Belgian Jesuit, had been ordered to the site, it concluded, because the Chinese gentlemen who have brought us the news have omitted many particular details necessary for a full clarification. Yet what were these particular details that the Jesuits required and that they felt had been omitted by Shang Gingyu and Li Xiao? The author's own summary, admittedly, is also extremely cursory and glosses over a number of obscure or otherwise distracting fine points, many of which defy translation and remain a matter of enormous scholarly controversy. As in most educated Chinese writing, the text is also exceedingly multivalent and frequently alludes to or otherwise echoes the Chinese classics and a variety of other ancient sources and idioms, just as it repeatedly makes use of explicitly Buddhist or Taoist terminology in its attempt to characterize the beliefs and practices of the luminous religion. Indeed, one is often at a loss to translate large portions of the inscriptions into modern Chinese as well. This untranslatability is crucial, moreover, since it demonstrates the kind of accommodation or adaptation that was necessary, not only for early modern readers to understand the text as an explicitly Christian one, but also for the original author of the inscription to characterize the luminous religion in terms of the Chinese language and Chinese cultural traditions. The inscription itself admits that Qingqiao is only an approximation. Secondly, the author too had probably unfairly emphasized the first part of the inscription, since it contains so many familiar doctrinal details for Western readers, when in fact it is arguable that much of this material is only vaguely Christian, despite the fact that some form of the Trinity, the sign of the cross, a Messiah, a virgin birth, and even a possible reference to baptism are all mentioned. Moreover, the author's emphasis on the first part of the text is problematic, because the historical section is not only much longer, but in a sense far more important, since it is able to boast that the sect had been sanctioned and even financially supported by numerous Chinese emperors. This was precisely what gave the religion its credibility in a Chinese context. For Chinese viewers, in other words, whose culture was so heavily grounded in a sense of antiquity and ancestral tradition, the notion that the luminous religion had been recognized by Tang dynasty emperors was absolutely central. This was also a lesson the Jesuits had to learn. According to their own testimony, as well as that of the contemporary Chinese converts, when the missionaries arrived at the end of the 16th century, they soon discovered that the most common objection to their teaching was that Christianity was seen as too modern. Everyone praises the doctrine and example of the learned men from the West, Li Shishao observed. Nevertheless, many have still been sceptical because they regard it as something new. An early Jesuit commentator noted that visitors to the missionaries were wont to say, "We are grateful for the teaching which you have brought to us from far away, but why were they not brought to our ancestors as well? Why have they reached us so tardily?" At the end of the 17th century, the emperor himself was said to have voiced a similar objection, as recorded in the memoirs of Jesuit Louis Le Comte. If the knowledge of Jesus Christ is necessary for salvation, and if God desires the salvation of all men, why has he long kept us, i.e. China, in ignorance and error? It is now above 16 ages since your religion, the only way men have to obtain salvation, has been established in the world. We knew nothing of it here. Is China so inconsiderable as not to deserve to be thought of, while so many barbarous nations have been enlightened? European readers, of course, could disdainfully think of this as typically backward Chinese reasoning, since it represented a way of thinking that placed China and not Europe as the acme of human cultivation. Ricci came up against the same irreducible difference when he tried to present the emperor and was caught with a map of the world that did not fix the Chinese empire in its proper position in the centre. From a Chinese perspective, however, the emperor's reasoning made perfect sense, and if Christian knowledge were really so essential to salvation, it certainly would have managed to spread beyond the barbarous nations that compromised the Western world. We recall watching a lecture by an American university scholar professor. I can't remember his last name. It's like Roy Castaneda or something. And he stated that when Rome was invaded by the barbarians, excuse me, they had this language that to them sounded like they were saying ba 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 like that. So they called them barbarians. But someone says, no, that's a load of rubbish. But it is in Roy Casagranda's lecture. Okay? And the guy is the expert, a professor, etc. So he's done the research. It's on his was it like Invasion of the Muslim lecture? Or he talks about Islam quite extensively. And that's what he said to the Romans. They sounded like they were saying ba 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 when they spoke. So they called them barbarians. Okay. As the monument supposedly and gloriously proved, This knowledge had spread to China nearly 1,000 years before, having even been sanctioned by a number of highly respected emperors. China has not been so much neglected as it thinks, Lecomte confidently replied. And if Christianity had subsequently died out, the Chinese may thank themselves, who by a criminal neglect and voluntary stubbornness did so easily part with the gift of God. From a Christian point of view, that is, there was now unequivocal proof that the religion's introduction in the late 16th century was not really an introduction at all. It was only a kind of renewal. As Xi'an put it very simply, probably the first Westerner to see the tablet in person. By this, we can learn that in ancient times the law of Christ had penetrated into China. And what did it mean for a Western viewer, in this case a 17th century Jesuit missionary, to conclude that the Qingjiao religion described on the stone corresponds to the law of Christ as he understood it to be, or that a millennium before his own evangelical journey to the Middle Kingdom, a religion equivalent to his had already been disseminated in the Chinese Empire? What might it mean for Christians, whether European or Chinese, to believe that they had found incontestable proof that their religion had a Chinese past? One of the most influential early European texts to include a discussion of the tablet was Alvaro Semedo's History of the Great and Renowned Monarchy of China, 1655, originally published in Italian from a Portuguese manuscript in 1643. Semedo, the Jesuit procurator of China and Japan, came to inspect the stone personally in 1628, just 3 years after its discovery. He took no thought for anything else, he admitted. He saw it and read it, and went often to read, behold, and consider it at leisure. He too immediately determined it as proof that the Jesuits did not represent the first establishment of the Christian religion in China, but rather a re-establishment of it. And his book featured a separate chapter on the stone along with the first easily accessible translation and commentary of the inscription in toto. But this was also the first time, and certainly not the last, that the monument was placed in the context of a history of China from an entirely Western point of view, of course, where it took an absolutely fundamental role in the narrative that sought to integrate the country's stereotypically great and renowned qualities with its present potential, thanks to the missionaries, to become a properly civilized Christian nation. Put another way, the monument quickly became the very means of transition between China's celebrated past and, as Semedo put it, the great darkness of its godless present. The stone itself was a spiritual jubilee and an irrefragable testimony of the ancient Christianity in China, which had been so much desired and sought after. And here is a page from Alvaro Semedo's History of the Great and Renowned Monarchy of China in the National Taiwan University Library. Okay, we're going to go forward a bit to find something else related to the Nestorian Church that's of interest. All of this evidence was certainly sketchy at best, and yet Ricci's letter still concludes that we understand that there is absolutely no doubt now that China is Marco Polo the Venetian's Cathay, and that what he says is quite true, that there are Christians in Cathay, for in his day there would have been many. That is, there was a possibility of finding Christian traces that made the equation between Cathay and China complete, and the fact that such evidence was not forthcoming was precisely the problem. It was no marvel if we were in doubt and perplexity, Semedo confesses, considering the great scarcity of evidence signs for proving a thing of such so great importance. The overwhelming desire for such evident signs must also have been behind the emergence of a new legend that began cropping up in missionary accounts in the mid-16th century, namely that the Apostle Thomas had journeyed to China. The disciple of Christ, Thomas, had journeyed to China. A similarly curious mixture of fact and fantasy, the St. Thomas myth and St. Thomas Christians had long been an inseparable part of the European imaginary about the Eastern world in general. They didn't believe it, it was all mythical fantasy. According to legends dating back at least to the early 12th century, Thomas had gone to India, where he built his churches, converted many of the local inhabitants, and was martyred in 52 AD. So he founded and built 7 to 9 of them before he was martyred by 2 Brahmins. They were very jealous, so they ran him through with a sword or a spear. But in a new version related in 1546 by St. Francis Xavier, the pioneer Jesuit missionary in East Asia, whose final unfulfilled dream was to convert China, St. Thomas had journeyed to the Middle Kingdom as well. His tomb at Milapur on the southeastern coast of India had long been known and seemed to substantiate at least part of the tradition, but it was unclear to St. Francis too if the apostle had actually journeyed any further eastward. In the 1569 Tratado of Gaspar da Cruz, we also read that Thomas had stayed among the Chinese for only a very short time, having quickly realised that he could not do any good there, a stereotypical remark about the resolutely atheistic nature of the Chinese nation. If these disciples whom the apostle had left had made fruit in the land, Cruz notes, we do not know it, for generally among them is no notice of the evangelical law, nor of Christianity, nor even of one God, nor a trace thereof. Okay. And it continues. Although here the apostles' failure is credited to the fact that China was then occupied with civil wars. In 1609, a third variant reported that Thomas had even arrived in China on a Chinese ship. But the fact that these versions of the legend were new to the 16th century is extremely revealing, since it is evident that they had developed the response to a pressing need not only to find Christianity but also to justify and sustain the missionaries' own evangelical struggle. Medieval travellers to Cathay had mentioned the apostle in relation to India only, even as they regularly stopped at the site of his tomb before setting out further east. John of Montecovino, for example, a Franciscan friar writing from China at the end of the 13th century, went out of his way to note that to these regions there never came any disciple of the apostles. Ricci wondered whether the Chinese might have heard about Christianity, since the early apostles preached it at exactly the same time that Buddhism first entered the country. But much more tantalizing were reports from Muslim merchants that in Cathay they had seen white, bearded, robed men who worshipped Mary and Jesus and the cross. Trigault provided a similar rumour in a letter of 1607, but when he edited Ricci's papers for publication in 1615, he added a much simpler and more satisfying explanation in the form of proof that the apostle had been to China after all. The evidence, such as it was, came in the form of several passages in an ancient Chaldean breviary of St. Thomas, dating from at least the 7th century, which declared that the Chinese and Ethiopians were converted to the truth by him, and that through St. Thomas the kingdom of heaven took wing and sped its flight to the Chinese. These references became a standard component of subsequent missionary histories, although they were not always presented as conclusive. One can easily imagine how the discovery of the Xi'an Monument was just 10 years later could be seen to solve all the problems at once by proving that Christianity had truly been in China, that the Christians so often mentioned by Marco Polo and other early travellers were historically documented, that the Cathay in which these Christians resided was none other than modern-day China, and that most of all a new chapter in Chinese history could begin, in which Christianity, which was not at all new, as the Chinese had complained, might finally be able to take hold, for when legendary Cathay and modern China were last equated, or at least recognised as occupying more or less the same geographical space. It was the existence of Christianity that seemed to clear everything up. This was true not only in the eyes of the missionaries, whose main purpose was Christian expansion. For them it was as if the monument had been carved precisely according to their own self-image, as the true bearers of civilization and salvation. But from the perspective of any European reader, the terms by which the equation was expressed were hardly neutral, and the desire to find Cathay in China was not simply a matter of joining a mythic place in Polo or Mandeville with one in which Westerners were then residing or trading or attempting to colonize. It was instead a matter of defining a foreign place in terms of Christian, that is Western, presumptions. It was hardly a simple encounter, but an imposition of self-interested prejudice, a way of using or manipulating any native detail, such as a Xi'an monument, in terms of Europeans' overwhelming desire to see themselves in it. And the monument's cross, more than anything else, became the ground or the launching point for a long line of readers who saw the tablet not as a Tang dynasty object with a lengthy and elegant Chinese and Syriac inscription with its accompanying dragons and tortoise and clouds of flowers, but instead as an unambiguously European Christian tablet, which just happened to include the unwanted excrescence of Chinese and other motives. Semedo mentions that the cross is encompassed, as it were, with certain clouds, but it is much more significant for him that its extremities end in flowered deluces, after the fashion of that cross which is reported to have been found graved on the sepulchre of the Apostle St. Thomas, or the grave of St. Thomas, or the tomb, in the town of Maliapur in India, as they were anciently painted in Europe. In fact, the exact shape of the cross played a surprisingly fundamental role in the monument's reception over the next 2 centuries. And yet, even if the messy configuration between Christianity, Cathay and China seemed to be solved by the discovery of the Xi'an monument, there was still the necessity of framing its inscription and its cross into a text that suited European purposes. Thus, numerous parallels were found between Christianity and local Chinese religious practices. Mendoza is careful to point up similarities between his own religion and those of China, if that is, they are interpreted Christianity or Christianly. A 3-headed Chinese idol reminds him of the mystery of the Holy Trinity. Images of sages are similarly reminiscent of pictures with the ensigns of the 12 apostles, and the Chinese creation myth is said to bear a similitude of the truth and a conformity with the things of our Catholic religion, Catholic religion. These are predictable manoeuvres from a European point of view, but it is far more important to see the way in which anything good or noble among Chinese religion's beliefs was perceived, as Ricci put it, as containing some cognizance of the true divinity. According to Ricci, Confucianism seemed not only to have borrowed from the West, but actually to have caught a glimpse of light from the Christian Gospels. Cruz even wondered whether a female statue he saw in a Chinese temple, probably of Guanyin, the goddess of mercy, might be the image of Our Lady, or Mary, made by the ancient Christians that St. Thomas had left there, or by the occasion made, because the book Outline of History goes into great detail of that particular lady, Guanyin, saying that it was probably adopted and then adapted, like made into a Chinese goddess with child, as it was all over the world. And there's more information here. The monument could also allow Europeans to maintain the oddly backward but necessary position that Christianity was also the basis of Chinese beliefs, even if Chinese religion traditions were clearly so much older than, for instance, the Judeo-Christian Bible. A convenient way to see this process at work is to take note of the way the text of the Xi'an monument has been preserved in the Jesuit archives in Rome, specifically in the collection known as Japonica Sinica 1 to 4, a library of nearly 600 mostly 17th and 18th century Chinese texts. Here we find a combination of materials concerning the Chinese classics and Chinese history, works by the Jesuits written in Chinese, and texts by Chinese Christian converts. We also find Li Zhao's transcription, as well as 2 copies of a long Chinese commentary by Manuel Diaz Jr., first published in 1644, that also gave the text of the inscription and concluded with illustrations of 3 other engraved crosses that had recently been found in southern China. Scattered reference to the monument or to Da Qin occur through the collection, but it's much more revealing to see just how important the inscription had become with respect to the Jesuits' view of Chinese culture in general. So it sounds like they're trying to butter them up and say, oh yeah, you're all your Buddhism and etc. etc. It's similar to Western Christianity. Yeah, it sounds like that. Maybe not. An excellent review essay on the archives has been recently concluded, at that time, first section in particular, in which the text by Lee and Diaz both appear, has been very carefully and deliberately compiled, probably sometime in the early 18th century. The section begins with a small corpus of text, or body of text, of classical Chinese literature, Book of Changes, the 4 books, the sayings of Confucius, and so on, followed by Diaz's commentary on the monument. Next comes text in which Chinese Christians elucidate the classics, Chinese texts by European missionaries, and finally religious writings by the Chinese converts themselves. There are several points of interest here. First, the progression from the Chinese classics to missionary texts to Christian writings by native converts reflects the general Jesuit policy of accommodation with respect to Chinese history and Chinese culture. In other words, China was to be converted from within by mastering and appealing to the Chinese tradition and the Chinese language as much as possible. Yes, as we said before, it's a way to butter them up. And not simply by imposing Christianity onto religious beliefs. They are often so much at odds with those of the West. From the Jesuit point of view, therefore, one had to begin with the Chinese literature and Chinese commentary, since they would remain the basis for Christianity in China. There's more information here. So that was a way to convince them, probably, and to get them to accept their Jesuit texts, probably, their religion, maybe, or Western Christianity, probably Roman Catholicism, something like that. Maybe not. Okay, so this guy P.Y. Saki, we mentioned in another video where it compared the translation of the stone with the other guy, the European. The point, however, is that Da Kun, like Qingjiao, had quickly become synonymous with early modern Christianity, even as some early missionary texts, such as the Jesuit Annual Report that was mentioned above, remained skeptical. The Xi'an monument may not have been able to lay to rest every doubt about whether the apostle had really been in China, the Apostle Thomas, or whether Cathay and China were really the same place, but it did have a way of helping each of these elements fit together into a relationship in which each one seemed to, at least, to support the others. The St. Thomas Christians of India may not have been identical with those who migrated to China, but legends about the apostle and the passages in the Indian breviary lent credibility to the idea that the Qingjiao religion might be identical to the form of Christianity described by so many travellers to Cathay. And somehow, although it never was quite clear how this should be accomplished, all of these strands could be accommodated into the tenets of early modern Roman Catholic Christianity. Probably sent emissaries. Thomas probably sent emissaries from India through to China. The author here states he would like to conclude by returning to a question with which we began, namely, why should anyone in China, aside from scholars or those who were already Christian converts, pay much heed to the monument at all? Although, of course, we cannot answer this query with any degree of accuracy, it might nonetheless be instructive to pause for a moment to review some of the early evidence. European commentators such as Samedo believe that Chinese viewers were attracted to the stone because it was old and because it contained strange writing. According to his account, there was a wonderful concourse of people to see the stone, partly for the antiquity thereof and partly for the novelty of the strange characters which was to be seen thereon, or underneath the Chinese. In 1667, Athanasius Kirch's China illustrator repeated the story, adding that the governor wanted to allure and draw many more out of the whole kingdom to the acquiring of reputation to the city. The Comte's version even noted that the stone was very nicely examined, because on the top of it there was a large cross handsomely graved. Although at risk of unnecessarily homogenizing a Chinese as opposed to a European viewpoint, the author couldn't help but wonder the degree to which the age of the stone and its Syriac writing and its cross were Western preoccupations and not those of anyone in Xi'an at the time. Both Sameda and Kircher endow the Chinese with a natural curiosity, or a certain natural propensity unto things curious. But who exactly are the ones overcome with curiosity here, and for what sorts of reason? Certainly visitors did come to the temple where the monument was eventually set up, but there are also at least 3 other versions of its discovery that give us a somewhat different picture of the sort of excitement that the stone engendered at the time. Most European commentators follow the Xi'an and remark that the stone was found when digging for the foundation of a building or a wall. However, Daniele Bartoli's History of the Jesuits in China, first published in 1633, also claimed that in 1639 a French Jesuit was visited by an old man from the area who claimed that for many years local residents were puzzled by the fact that a small space of ground had always remained completely free from snow during the winter. They were convinced that something must be buried there, or a treasury as they hoped. When digging was finally begun, Bartoli continues, they found a treasure after all, the very stone we are speaking about. It is hard to imagine that this was the kind of treasure that the villagers had in mind, and at this point Bartoli lapses into a stereotypical description of the inquisitiveness of Chinese people, how the literati were attracted to the stone on account of its antiquity, and how the local governor, wondering at its age and the mysteries of its foreign writing, had the stone mounted on a pedestal and set up in a nearby temple. One second example is a very story recorded in a letter from 1653 by a Polish Jesuit, Michael Boehm, that was included in Kirch's China Illustrator. The governor of the place, Boehm reports, being certified concerning the finding of the monument, was smitten both with the novelty of the thing and with an omen, for on that very day his son departed the world. He passed away. A much fuller treatment of the same story forms our third and last example, this time a Chinese account written in 1679 by Lin Tong, a great authority on ancient inscriptions. The passage was accepted in a massive compilation of nearly 1,000 metal and stone inscriptions by another great authority, Wang Chang, published in 1805. The prefect of Xi'an, the story goes, had a little boy who was endowed with high intelligence at his birth. From the time he was able to walk, he began to join his hands in supplication to Buddha, which he did day and night almost without relaxation. In a short time he was taken sick and died. The place for his burial was chosen by divination, and when they had dug several feet into the ground they discovered a stone which was a tablet commemorating the spread of the Qingjiao religion, the luminous religion. The monument had been embedded in the earth for 1,000 years, and now for the first time it reappeared. If one sees this event as proof of the succession of direct and indirect causes through the 3 epochs, i.e. past, present and future, could it not be said that this child was a pure Dutta come back into the world, or some sort of Buddha, i.e. that he was a reincarnation? Owing to its frequent Buddhistic terminology and allusion, this passage has proven very difficult to translate, particularly the last sentence as cited here, but the point certainly seems to be that the godliness of the child is somehow signalled or echoed in the religious evidence contained in the inscription. and that the monument's discovery was a divine sign of the child's place in the larger scheme of Buddhist metempsychosis, past, present, and future. The discovery of the stone, in other words, is mystically connected to the departed spirit of the godlike little boy, even if he was seen as a devout Buddhist, and the monument was describing a very different kind of religious teaching. The mysterious other writing, Lin Dong added, who apparently mistook it for Sanskrit or Mongolian, was the same as that used in the Buddhist classics. Moreover, his account concludes with a scholarly flourish by recalling a much older tale of a man whose family, when starting to dig in the spot he had chosen for his own tomb, found an inscription with his name on it, showing, among other things, that his life was the subject of prophecy and that the spot for the tomb was correctly chosen according to the principles of Feng Shui. We will end it there. We may do a part 2. We hope that you enjoyed this and that it opened your eyes to the Nestorian Church, St. Thomas, the Apostles, and how they went across to China, and their texts were examined and approved by certain Chinese leaders, who then gifted them and built churches for them, and so forth, and decreed many things in regard to them, and a lot of converts were brought to Christ. A lot of Chinese were converted and brought to Christ. We are bringing you this to hopefully make all see that this church was, though persecuted for 18 centuries because of their faith, the way they did things, they were blessed with many things through God, through the power of the Holy Spirit, etc. They seem to have done things a very, very different way to the modern Christian churches of today, or the earlier ones, and they seem to have this reverence for God, this faith. They dedicated themselves totally to Him, even though under great persecution for 18 centuries, etc. And God blessed them miraculously, abundantly, is what it seems like in a lot of these books, these videos, based on these books that we are bringing to you. Or because they had true regret, sorry for the sins that they had committed in their lifetime, and in tears, etc., wanted to know how to be saved, how to be freed from those sins, because they knew something was going to come upon them, right, for those sins. Okay, so hopefully it opened your eyes to, as we said, to this first church, the Apostolic Church of the East, the Nestorian Church, and so forth. If you like this video, then subscribe to us, give us a like, add your comments below, and then go share this video, our channel and our videos, with all your family, friends, neighbours, church friends, mosque friends, or temple friends. Thank you for taking the time to watch this particular video. We may bring you a part 2.